What happens when a wealthy father discovers his black maid sleeping on the floor with his newborn twins? And the shocking bruise on her face reveals a truth that will shatter everything he thought he knew about his own home. Where are you watching from? Comment below before we dive into today's story. Helen Jefferson moved like a ghost through the empty halls. Her worn shoes squeaked against the cold marble floor. She had been cleaning this mansion since dawn, scrubbing, polishing, making everything perfect for a man who never noticed. Her blue uniform was still damp with sweat from hours of backbreaking work. The mansion felt more like a tomb than a home. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors stared down from golden frames, their eyes following her every move with silent judgment. The marble floors were so polished they reflected the crystal chandeliers above, creating a world of cold beauty that had no room for warmth. She wasn't hired to be a nanny. She was just the maid. But when the last babysitter quit months ago, no one else came. The responsibility of caring for James Sterling's twin boys had fallen on Helen's shoulders like a heavy stone she couldn't put down. Mason and Marcus were only 3 months old. Their mother had died giving birth to them. A tragedy the house staff whispered about in dark corners, afraid to speak too loudly in case they woke the ghosts that seemed to haunt these halls. Their father, a man who could move millions with a single phone call, had become a stranger in his own home. He was always gone. Business trips, meetings, phone calls that lasted until midnight. Anything to avoid the pain of looking at his sons and seeing his dead wife's eyes. Tonight was different. Tonight was hell. The twins had been screaming for hours. Marcus burned with fever, his tiny face red as fire, his small body shaking with chills that broke Helen's heart. Mason cried until his voice was raw, his little fists shaking with pain that seemed to come from his very soul. Helen had tried everything. Warm bottles that they refused, gentle rocking that only made them cry harder, soft lullabies her grandmother used to sing back in Alabama when Helen was just a scared little girl herself. Nothing worked. Nothing helped. The nursery was freezing cold, like stepping into a refrigerator. The heating had been broken for weeks, and no one seemed to care enough to fix it. The cribs were hard as stones, with mattresses that felt like concrete slabs. She couldn't put the babies in there. Not when they were sick. Not when they needed warmth more than anything else in the world. In the living room, she found salvation. The fireplace glowed like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Helen spread a white blanket on the Persian rug and laid the twins down gently, as if they were made of the finest glass. She knelt beside them, her body shielding them from the cold draft that crept through the mansion like a thief stealing warmth. Her muscles screamed for rest. Her back ached from hours of scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. The yellow cleaning gloves stuck to her sweaty hands, making her skin itch. But she stayed. She watched their tiny chests rise and fall like delicate butterflies. She listened to their breathing slow from panicked gasps to gentle sighs. And finally, when exhaustion claimed her too, she couldn't fight it anymore. She lay down beside them, close enough to feel their warmth mixing with the heat from the fire. The flames crackled softly like a mother's whisper. The twins' breathing became her lullaby, steady and peaceful. She told herself she would only close her eyes for a moment, just long enough to rest her burning eyelids. The front door slammed like a gunshot echoing through a cemetery. James Sterling stepped inside, shaking snow from his expensive coat like he was shaking off the troubles of the world. His suit was perfect, pressed and tailored to fit his tall frame. His shoes were polished to mirrors that could blind a person. He carried himself like a king entering his castle, his briefcase in one hand, car keys jingling in the other. He took 2 steps toward his study, then stopped dead in his tracks. There, on his living room floor, lay a scene that hit him like a punch to the gut. Helen lay curled around his sons like a protective shield, her cleaning gloves still on her hands. A dark bruise staining her cheek like spilled ink. The baby slept peacefully in the circle of her arms, safe and warm and loved in a way that made his throat close up with emotions he'd buried months ago. "What is this?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Helen jumped awake, her heart pounding like thunder in a storm. She sat up carefully, one hand instinctively moving to protect the babies. "They've been crying for hours," she said, her voice shaking like leaves in the wind. "Marcus has a fever that won't break. I couldn't put them in that freezing nursery. They needed warmth. They needed someone to care." "You're not their nanny," James said coldly, though something in his chest was starting to crack like ice in spring. "Why are you sleeping on my floor?" "Because they needed me," Helen replied quietly, her chin lifting with quiet dignity. "And no one else was here. No one else came when they cried." His eyes fixed on the bruise, painting her face purple and black, spreading across her cheekbone like a storm cloud. It was fresh but fading, the edges turning yellow-green. "What happened to your cheek?" Helen hesitated, her fingers unconsciously touching the tender skin. The memory still hurt worse than the actual blow. "Last week's party, one of your guests, that man in the gray suit with the loud laugh. He said I was in his way when I was carrying drinks. He pushed me hard against the wall. I fell and hit the corner. No one helped me up. They just stepped over me like I was garbage." Something cracked inside James Sterling. Not just cracked, but shattered completely. He remembered that night clearly now. Champagne flowing like water, laughter echoing off the walls, important phone calls about deals worth millions. He had been upstairs in his office, making money while a woman was being hurt in his own home. He hadn't noticed anything wrong because he hadn't been looking. He never looked anymore. "No one helped you?" The question came out like a whisper carried on the wind. "No," she said simply. No anger in her voice, no blame or accusation. Just tired acceptance of a world that had taught her not to expect kindness from people like him. James looked down at his son sleeping peacefully in Helen's arms. Mason had his tiny fist wrapped around the edge of the blanket. Marcus's face was peaceful now, the fever broken by the warmth and care of someone who truly loved them. For the first time in months, he truly saw them, not as problems to solve or responsibilities to manage or painful reminders of what he'd lost, but as his children. Fragile, precious, needing love more than money. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, something was changing. "Follow me," he said finally, his voice different now. Softer somehow, less sharp around the edges. In his office, surrounded by dark wood and flickering firelight that danced across the walls like living shadows, Helen told him everything. How the nannies had left one by one, each citing different reasons, but all meaning the same thing. They couldn't handle working for a man who was never there. How she had been doing 2 jobs for the price of one, cleaning by day and caring for babies by night. How she fed them with bottles she warmed with her own hands, changed them on floors because the changing table was in the frozen nursery, held them when they cried because no one else would answer their calls for comfort. "You could have asked for help," James said weakly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how empty they sounded. "From who?" Helen's voice was steady as steel, strong as the mountains back home. "The other staff barely speak to me unless it's about work that needs doing. And you," she paused, meeting his eyes directly. "You're never here long enough to see them, let alone me. When you are here, you walk past that nursery like it's haunted." The truth hit him like a physical blow to his chest. He had been hiding from his sons, afraid that loving them would hurt too much if he lost them too. But in trying to protect his heart, he had abandoned theirs. "They don't need another check written in their names, Mr. Sterling," Helen continued, her words cutting through his defenses like a hot knife through butter. "They don't need trust funds or college accounts or inheritance plans. They need a father who holds them when they cry. They need someone who knows the sound of their laughter." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fireplace. James felt them settle in his chest, heavy and unmovable as stones. He had been a fool. Worse than a fool, he had been a coward. Without speaking, he left the room. Helen heard his footsteps on the stairs, the opening and closing of doors. When he returned, he carried 2 blue blankets from the nursery. The soft ones that had never been used because he couldn't bear to go into that room where baby clothes still hung unworn and toys sat gathering dust. He knelt beside his sons on the living room floor like a man approaching an altar. With trembling hands, he touched Mason's soft hair. The contact sent electricity through his heart, waking feelings he thought had died with his wife. The baby's hair was silky and warm, smelling like innocence and hope. "They're smaller than I remember," he whispered, his voice breaking like a teenage boy's. "They grow every day," Helen said softly. "Marcus can almost hold his head up now. Mason smiles when he hears music. They need you to see these things." James wrapped the blankets around his sons with hands that shook like leaves in an earthquake. When he stood, his voice was different, warmer, stronger, filled with a determination that surprised even him. "Things change starting now," he declared, looking Helen straight in the eyes. "You won't scrub another floor in this house unless you choose to. You'll be their official caregiver, with proper pay and respect. And that man who hurt you, he'll never step foot in this house again. I'll make sure of that." The days that followed flowed by like a gentle river finding its way to the sea. Mornings brought coffee and story time, James reading to his sons while they gurgled and cooed and reached for the colorful pictures with tiny hands. Helen smiled easier now. The constant weight lifted from her shoulders like clouds clearing after a storm. One rainy afternoon, thunder rolling across the sky like bowling balls in heaven, they sat together on the sofa. Helen with both babies, James arriving home wet from the storm, his hair dripping and his tie askew. "Room for one more?" he asked, his voice soft as silk, warm as summer honey. Helen made space without hesitation, and James joined them, taking his sons into his arms where they belonged. The fire crackled. The rain drummed peacefully on the windows like nature's own lullaby. For the first time in forever, the Sterling mansion felt like home instead of a museum. That night, as lightning painted the sky silver and thunder sang them to sleep, they stayed together in the warm living room. James lay on the couch with the twins on his chest, feeling their heartbeats against his own. Helen curled beside them, her hand resting on the blanket covering them all like a blessing. As sleep took them in its gentle arms, Helen's final thought was crystal clear. Family isn't about blood or money or names written on birth certificates. It's about showing up when it matters most. It's about love that stays when everything else falls away. It's about being there in the darkness until the light comes home. The Sterling mansion had found its heart at last, beating strong and true in the warmth of 3 souls who chose each other when the world grew cold.